great to see so many familiar names and faces here. Not everybody I've met before, but a few people I've met before, which is great. And it seems like there's a good cross-referencing of different practices, processes, philosophical ideals, conceptual ideals, technical practices. When I put my slides together for this particular talk, I always rearrange my slides for every talk. I realized that this talk was going to be a kind of lecture of two parts, because around about 2019 and the pandemic, like many people, that meant I needed to shift my practice. I wasn't able to travel anymore, so I began doing other kinds of work, and I began doing analog work and writing and stuff. So my talk is going to be, like I say, in two parts. Firstly, really related to the title, The Listening Eye, which is going to explore my performative work, particularly an area potentially called, it's got many names, but visual music, audio-visual practice, particularly this idea of interlinking sound and imagery in different ways, philosophically, conceptually, and technically. And I'll be talking about different parts of that. You know, there'll be some technical stuff and there'll be some philosophical stuff. But I think it's always interesting to see the lineage of how people sort of arrived at their point. So I'll just give you a quick background on my trajectory. I originally studied textile design back in 1989. So you can guess my age from that. I studied textile design and then studied fine art at Goldsmiths College. The textile design's a funny thing because it came back to haunt me, as often our lineages do. They come back and haunt us. But after studying fine art at Goldsmiths, I found myself in the enviable position of being unemployed and unemployable, as many artists are, unless you've got some amazing backer or you have representation in a gallery. So I spent the next few years wondering what to do, really, because although I was still doing a lot of painting, it was like, I need to have a career, I need to find a way forward. And around 1995, 96, 97, this thing called the internet popped up. And I was like, wow, this looks like fun. Network culture, I can find stuff online that I'm very interested in. I can connect with like minds. And as a result of finding the internet, I decided I wanted to build a website. And finding that I could use this technology and create rudimentary pages, I actually found myself employable. So I ended up having a job as a web dev. It sounds like a bit of a long story, but it's kind of important in the trajectory. While I was designing websites for fairly boring corporate sites, I saw a piece of software that someone was using to create animations, and it was called Macromedia Flash. This was around, this is the late 90s, 98, 99. And I can see some people nodding over there, and everybody that knows Flash will have this love-hate relationship. But I think it's an interesting area because it's where many of us cut our teeth as programmers. I saw someone playing around with Flash in the studio, and I was like, what's that? I need to know what that is, because this looks much more fun than what I'm doing. And I found out it was Flash, and I was like, I want to do this. Can I do this? And I was given the opportunity to make a few things. And then I was the guy in the studio that designed mouse toys for websites to load. So back in the day, around the year 2000, we were still using dial-up modes, and basically, while you were waiting for websites to load, because they might be 2 or 3 megabyte, you needed a little thing to play with. So my job, I had this great job, I thought it was the best job in the world. I designed mouse toys with ActionScript for people to play with, and corporate websites had these, you know. I did one for a Mercedes, you know. It was a crazy time, because when you think about how unusable these websites were and how they were really veils to actually get to the product, but nonetheless, it was the time when the web really needed to be flashy. And so that was where I really started getting into this idea of generative strategies, you know, because I had to learn coding, and, you know, the web was full of these really interesting websites where they were just flash experiments. And I built a website, and this was really where I started to get into this idea of iteration and algorithms and symmetry and repetition. And I started to learn about more rudimentary sort of programming techniques. So that just gives you a little intro into where from A to getting to this kind of programmatic realm. So as you can see from the slides, I've made installation work. I've done lots of AV performances for festivals around the world, some big ones in Spain. I did some for Sona. I've also performed at Mutec. I create audiovisual performances where I work on the sound, but I also collaborate with other artists. I'm very much interested in exploring, or have been interested in exploring, expanded cinema scenarios, which is ways of moving beyond just a simple screen. So I think there's some slides up here of planetariums, for example. I've worked in planetariums and large screen scenarios. Here you can see a 23-meter wide screen. And then I've also worked in environments where there's 360-degree screen, so the projection is all the way around you and you actually sit in the middle. I've worked with classical musicians. Sometimes these are kind of very remote connections with people in different countries. This was actually a show in Gijón, actually in northern Spain. So the talk is going to be fairly chronological, actually. But I want to start off with really showing a kind of Venn diagram of my sort of various vested interests in it, and probably posit the idea of me sitting in the middle somewhere. So I use generative and software art because I like the idea of using algorithms and parameterization to be able to tune these performances on the fly. But one of my favorite things about randomness is serendipity, the idea that you can create these systems, and then you can come up with, it can generate unpredictable outcomes that can be surprising. I'm also interested in the idea that generative strategies allow me to control many things, many instances, many objects within the scenography of what I'm trying to explore. So I call it the cult of the multiform for me, you know, because a lot of the time I'm using multiple instances of objects and creating these fairly complex compositions. Another term that's been used is array aesthetics. This idea that, you know, you have an array of objects which then can generate these spatial compositions. So that's the generative side. Then I've also been interested in the history of cybernetic, expanded and live cinema, which I know there's a few experts in the audience. And people like Jordan Belson and Kenneth Knowlton and Lillian Schwartz, who worked at Bell Labs. These are a great inspiration for me. Seeing their work, it's that kind of moment where you have that eureka moment where you go, aha, this is exactly what I want to do, because I'm understanding that they're using abstraction as a kind of emotional language as well as just a pure abstractive language. And it's almost as if their form of abstraction they can only say what they want to say with these forms. They can't say it in any other way. If they were using words, they would use words. If they were using, you know, any other kind of idiom, they would use another idiom. But they need to use these kinds of abstract forms, and that interests me. But also, as I said, I'm interested in expanded use of cinema, multiple projections, and use of lasers, projecting onto bodies. And this was kind of quite informative on the way I started to think about using the screen. And the third area is visual music, which has a long history. It goes back to the 1920s and 1930s. People like Oscar Fischinger, Mary Ellen Butte, who used oscilloscopes, Norman McLaren, who's got a whole range of films. These guys used to do things with what was known as optical soundtracks, where they used to run actually the images through a magnetic device which would transduce the changes on the film and turn that directly into sound. So some of these were very mechanical translations. Some of them are more associative, you know, and some of them are also more metaphorical. So there's lots of different ways of approaching this binding between sound and image. So if you take all of these into account, I used to call myself, because obviously I'm shifting now, a visual musician who uses generative strategies to create live cinematic performances, cross-wiring sound and space and form to create precise time-based narratives. It's always good to see some of those early inspirations. There is stuff by Oscar Fischinger there. There's Larry Kuber's work. I love the idea that back in the day, Whitney had to produce one frame at a time of his films and then photograph them and then do this again and again. I mean, and we have this luxury of technology whereby we can do these things at a much faster rate. And one of the things I like to go back on is how can we make artwork that doesn't talk of technology? How do we make artworks that are future-proof? Because software is always changing. And when I look at my older work, I'm like, well, I would do that differently now. Now I have faster processing power. Would it change the aesthetic? So while we're working with technology, I think it's always good to try to think about making these things future-proof so that the aesthetics is not entirely connected to the programmatic prowess of the systems that you're using. Expanded cinema, Moholy-Nagy, Knowlton, as I already mentioned, stuff from the Bauhaus. These are just really kind of influences into what's gone on over the years. And the kind of utopian architecture, I've been into culture, countercultural architecture, utopian architecture, and also Soviet constructivism. These have all kind of, these multiple layers have gone into my work. So I start now with a sort of chronological sort of exposure of my work. This was the first piece that kind of I had shown in a fairly large exhibition, Talasys, which Talasys is really a start of our range of a series of works which explore feedback. I was working with standard feedback with a camera whereby you point a camera at the output and it creates an emergence of imagery. And I needed to make an installation for a gallery, but these systems are notoriously hard to deal with. So I realized that I could simulate the standard feedback experiment with software, which is what I did. And the great thing is it came up with a completely different aesthetic. I mean, rather than it being really grungy and noisy, these things were very sharp and very specific, intimating sort of hyperbolic tessellations. So this was shown at Artificial Motion, an exhibition of cybernetic work and interfaces. The original piece was shown at a wonderfully titled The Crystal Punk Workshop for Soft Architecture. So in this piece, what I like about this is it's a very economical methodology. There's just one single square that I'm using here, and the square is passed around a loop of renderers, and then as it moves around the renders, this small transformation. So the square, before it gets to the first render, it gets shifted or tilted or rotated, so that then it goes round again, and then you get these transformations of transformations. And I've always been interested in these systems whereby you get complexity from the most minimal of prescriptions or recipes. This piece has also been shown in a variety of different situations and installations. This piece, Talasys, really began a sort of kind of a much longer exploration into this very simple technique of emergence and iteration through what is essentially a recursive function, actually. You know, video feedback is really a recursive function. What you're doing is you're taking the output and then you're feeding it back in. But rather than this being a recursive function algorithm where you take the output of the algorithm, put it back into the function. This is actually video signal. So I like this. I've always been interested in these kinds of non-technical ways of mimicking computational systems. And later on, you'll see that I repurposed a typewriter to kind of do something similar, you know, find a way of mimicking algorithms. I like these non-traditional or non-direct routes. They appeal to me because I think they allow us to instinctively grasp things that maybe are more technically complex to explain. So I created a series of prints, actually, and these were called autotrophs. Now, an autotroph is an organism that creates its own sustenance. For example, something that uses light and photosynthesis and converts inorganic compounds into organic compounds to survive. It does this by its own means and just by using light. And one theory for morphogenesis is complex chemical feedbacks at a cellular level, this thing called chemotasis. So I like this idea. I mean, a lot of my work plays around with these kinds of references to biological or scientific or pataphysical or fictive or conjectural ideas. I like to add these to my process because it helps me to refine the outcome, the final aesthetics. I don't know if you guys are familiar with the work of Ernst Haeckel. He's the guy that traveled around. He had some connections with Darwin. In fact, he traveled on the HMS Challenger, and he made this beautiful book called Art Forms in Nature. Well, it wasn't. He illustrated these creatures called radiolarians. And I decided that I would lay these out as if they were kind of Victorian taxonomical textbooks, because they were, again, like I say, they were mimicking these very geometric, very precise, very symmetrical illustrations of Ernst Haeckel. Of course, one of the things is he actually imbued these drawings with a little bit of extra from his own imagination. So he idealized a little bit. They weren't perfect replicas of the things that he was drawing. And that part of the story always intrigued me as well, because he was also a slightly frustrated artist as well. As you know, there are other strange aspects to his story anyway. So I used to run this software, and I used to just pick variations out. So a thing that I've used over time is this idea of aesthetic natural selection, which is my own way of kind of tailoring an evolutionary progression to outcomes of algorithms. And something that I do, and I think something that we find we all do is if we're using code, is we sometimes have to fork iterations because we know that it's starting to go off into a different direction. And we know it's going so far, shifting so far in that direction, that really we need to put it in a folder for, save it for a rainy day, because clearly it's evolving into its own species. And I think code has this weird aspect where it can do that. It can start to go, it has a life of its own. And I think our engagement and our connection between the things that we create, particularly with code, because it has, again, its own genetic material to some extent, is very interesting. So yeah, I mean, I carried on playing with these recursive systems in various ways, and they became more and more, I mean, they kind of, I guess they reference different things. I mean, they reference kind of stuff that is done in op art, but they also reference potentially stuff like the stuff that Escher did with his hyperbolic tessellations. And I made some nice prints of these actually. Well, I mean, I thought they were nice. Quite large prints for a number of shows. This was the Root of the Root in 2010 in New York, actually, in Williamsburg. And then I was like wondering, well, these emergent structures are great, but I want to give them completely a life of their own. How can I do that? And I thought one way I can do that is sustain them with sound. Sound would be their food and their nourishing sustenance. So I began to experiment with this idea of using sound analysis to change the properties of these squares. And for example, I would do some frequency analysis, I would do some volume analysis on sound coming in, which I designed, and then depending on the frequency of the sound, the square would potentially move in a certain kind of way. For example, it could just move up and down, or it could change size. And the volume could inform another property. It could rotate the square, or it could, I mean, the list of potential possibilities are endless, but the idea is to give these things life. And what was fun is because when I started to add sound to these systems, the actual undulations and movements were very wave-like. So it was very nice that there was this kind of isomorphic representation between sound and the end result. Fortunately, I don't have a video of this piece. So the square is like a stylus, a seismograph to sound, and it moves, and as it moves, the whole mesh, the sound lattice, shifts and undulates according to the frequencies. And it was reminiscent of Hans Jenny's cymatic experiments, where there's these famous experiments, and I think many of you would be familiar with them, where sound is transducing a liquid or a powder, and it creates these very interesting geometric patterns. Depending on the frequency, the higher the frequency, the more complex these patterns become, because there's more nodal regions in the waves. The lower frequencies, there's less nodal regions, so the patterns tend to be more simpler. So this was another reference. So then this began a whole journey, really, of exploring cross-wired modalities, and thinking about ways of marrying sound and image in a number of different ways, technically, metaphorically, to create synchrony, synergy, convergence, synesthesia. I'd probably remove that from my slide now, because I think it's a sort of a strange word to use now. I think it's been used in the visual music circles, but it's often used more technically in medical descriptions of situations where people can hear sound, or they can hear visuals. Yeah, I mean, I made a whole bunch of pieces which really were parametrically modeling using sound to generate the images. And I'm using different kinds of techniques, sound analysis, domain mapping, using media and OSC, whereby I would send data from, for example, from the VVV patch, which I will talk about a little bit later. I would send data from the generative construction of these. I would send, for example, an array of their positions, and that would get turned into sound using OSC. Or I would map the rotational movements of these things, and because they're all rotating at different speeds, I could then send them to an array, and each of those rotational numbers could be then used to inform a frequency. There were many different ways that I was trying to figure out ways of sending data from one system to the other. It also worked in the opposite direction, whereby I'd use generative sound to generate images too. But in a performative scenario, closed systems are pretty boring, so you always need to kind of change these mappings, make these mappings performative. So I used to use MIDI controllers to shift and desync some of the couplings, so that there was more of a hands-on experience, and I could potentially speed things up, slow things down, and add fire to add flames to the fire, as it were, by increasing the density of these mappings, or making them more granular or making them less granular, so that I could play around with traditional techniques of narrative in a performance. I kind of became known for this piece, and I used to get a call, 3 or 4 calls a year, saying, "Can you perform this piece?" Because it got my name stamped onto it. So you can see the dates are 2012 to 2016. Cyclotron, a cyclotron for sound. Well, a cyclotron is actually a particle accelerator, and it works by having a magnetic field which holds charged particles in place, but then by changing rapidly the electric field, you can cause these particles to rotate and do very strange things. And so I like this idea of using this, again, this scientific idiom as a kind of metaphorical framework for creating this piece. I'll actually come back to Alfred Jarry a little bit later on, because I redeveloped this piece, and I'm going to say a little bit more about pataphysics. So, yeah, I mean, this piece is kind of, I wanted to create something anachronistic, so I went monochrome. I wanted to try and create something that felt old but new. I'm clearly referencing the architectonic forms of constructivism, one of my favorite periods of modern art, and one that I still come back to a lot for inspiration. And there's this idea of the physical, metaphorical, and conceptual conquering of space, particularly in Soviet history. There was a time when you have the constructivists, which to me were conquering the idea of space abstractly, but also you have the Soviet space program, which was conquering space on a physical level. So these two things kind of, again, fuse and create this kind of inspiration for me. The idea of conquering space, and yeah, I talk about Elizitsky, Malevich, Gustav Kluzic, and the famed architects of the time, including Chernikov, who create this wonderful book of conjectural architectural drawings, playing around with this idea of a kind of utopia, but clearly the utopia was slightly shaded by the politics. So there's always this kind of shadow holding above all of this kind of work, even though it's utopian and futuristic. You know, there was kind of some pretty bad stuff going on at the time, of course. It's also playing around with the idea of this hard-to-graph mathematical idea of 4D space, which is an extension of ordinary 3D space, vector 3D space, which some mathematicians claim to be able to, rigorously understand, but it actually exists only as an abstract concept. So I became interested in researching polytopes and hyperplanes. So technically speaking, I'm using a lot of shaders in these pieces, and these are programs that actually run on the GPU of your computer, and they allow you to access it at a faster level, to be able to do much more rigorous, much more efficient processing. I won't go too much into it, but these use a lot of effects which they run on the GPU, and again I can plug sound into them, so I can create these textures, these layers. I'm a big fan of blend modes. I think blend modes in art is very underrated, because it's almost seen as a kind of, I don't know, you have them in Photoshop and you use them in Photoshop, but in generative work you can do some really amazing things by playing around with these layerings of textures and color. So this uses a lot of blend modes, a lot of shader work, again all modulated by sound. This is a picture of me at art festival. It's one of the, we all have those photos that we keep aside them when someone asks for us for pictures of something to put on their website. This is the one that I always give them, just because it kind of gives a sense of scale. This is only a small part of the screen, actually. Again, I did mention 3D screen, the 360-degree screen, which is really beautiful to use. I mean, unfortunately, I didn't have time. I mean, it was technically feasible to map the whole thing around and have one large image. But anybody that's ever tried to play around with multiple screen projections knows that it can turn into a pain very quickly. There are various techniques and boxes out there that allow you to plug your computer in and split into 3 screens, but actually to do it in, I think we needed 12, was a little bit more tricky. So you can see there's repetitions, but nonetheless, it's a wonderful experience to be able to sit in the middle of a space rather than sit outside of a space. And when the sound is very immersive and you have a good sound system, you actually feel like you're inside the piece, which is something that I've always been interested in trying to do, rather than being an audience separated from the experience. So yeah, I'll just talk a little bit technically about how these are made. Actually, this uses a thing called the super formula, which is a generalization of the super ellipse. And I won't stay in this area too long because I don't want to get too technical. These are really simple forms that are kind of based on repetitions around a circle of either of convex or concaved lines. And this thing called the super formula was a generalization of the super ellipse. It was proposed by this guy who said it could map all forms of nature. I think given the complexity of any kind of algorithm, you can probably say the same. But what's interesting is when you start to modulate these shapes in 3D. So you have an equation for the flat version, and then you modulate the shape on the Z dimension. And you can create these Archimedean forms, these spirals, these stars. And so cyclotone really, and much of the work I'm going to show you, has been using these kinds of systems ever since. They're using these fairly simple equations, extruded into 3D, and then textured in a varietal way, using lots of blend modes, using lots of shader textures to texture these objects. And actually, it's actually quite a simple pipeline, really, a simple process. The complexity is just years of refining in one area, and I think that's something that we all do. We find our little niche, and then we keep refining and keep refining. And from afar, it may look like, you know, it's a really distant idiom and domain that you're in, but you've just, you know, you've been refining to such a point. And even when you go back and look at your old code base, you don't understand it anymore because you're so immersed in what you're doing. That was a little bit of a constructive video because obviously the live piece, it's actually quite difficult to record a live piece because the resolution of the videos are usually 60 frames per second at HD. So there are only, I mean, now it's a little bit easier to do this kind of stuff, but back in 2012 to try and record 60 frames per second at HD with the sound, it wasn't so easy. So these videos tend to be remapped as demonstrations. But in the live setting, I usually used to demand as big a sound system as I could get and as big a screen as I could get, because clearly these works were aimed, or particularly this work was aimed to be quite visceral, quite physical. With a really big screen, people at the front used to come away feeling really quite, like they'd been part of it, they had been spun around in this thing. Right, so let's just talk a little bit about my process. Well, someone asked me a question in a lecture one day. What comes first, the sound or the image, if you're making this sort of work? And it sounds like a really it sounds like a simple question. I mean, some people might mistake it as a naive question, but actually it's a very good question. And I think as artists, sometimes we work so instinctively that we're quite blind to our process. And there's nothing wrong with that, I think. I mean, it's great to, sit down and have a plan and be very conceptual, but sometimes the creative process takes us on a little journey, and we enjoy that because creativity is play. And actually, I started to think about what came first, particularly in these later works, the image or the sound, and I realized it was much more complicated than that. It was much more complicated than something coming first, because there was a to-ing and froing process, there was a feedback between the two. I'd start with one, and that would inform the other, and that would inform back again, and it would keep going. And then I started to make a kind of note of the processes, because I thought next time someone asks me that question, I can show them a few slides and tell them what's going on. So my process, I start off with field recordings. Pretty much that's where I start. I take field recordings from all around the world, both of nature and of particularly mechanical stuff, Wherever I am, I have my little R09 recorder, and if something takes my fancy and I think it sounds interesting, I'll record it. And I have huge amount of files with no names on, just something. And every now and again I go through them and I take stuff, or I remember where I took them and I know they're good sounds and I take them out and I label them and I put them in a folder and I got them. And what I do is for fun or for artistic reason, I listen to these recordings sometimes and I layer more than one or two and I let them play randomly while I'm writing. Because I've always been interested in sort of kind of this left field electroacoustic drone music. So, quite quickly these can start to sound musical. But what they do is they start to insinuate visual images. So as much as the eye can be listening, the sound can also be visualizing. And this connects to really the idea of acousmatic sound, this idea of veiled listening, this concept introduced by Pierre Schaeffer, which is, electroacoustic music is veiled listening. You're listening to the sound of ordinary things in life, maybe traffic or whatever, but it's actually through a loudspeaker, which means it's veiled. You're not listening to the real thing. And this comes from the acousmatoia, which is the disciples of Pythagoras. And Pythagoras asked them to listen to his lectures in a different room so that they wouldn't focus on him. They would only focus on the ideas. So for me, this is very interesting because I realized that I was actually using a kind of similar process. I was acousmatic scrying my own sounds. And what I would do is then I would start to write down insinuations of what these things sounded like and even start sketching them. And I would make little sketches because these sounds obviously came from the mechanized world, and then they would start to insinuate motions from a very abstract form. So what I would do is then from these cartoon sketches, I would start to create sketches in 4V. Now, I haven't actually talked about 4V yet, but I will do at some point. And I would use these sketches then to create these rudimentary systems with certain objects in space, rotating, moving, very mechanistic. And then from that, I would then look at these videos and then reinterpret them as sound. So this thing was constantly going backwards and forwards. Here are some sketching of sound insinuations. In fact, this is an interesting one because I was working with a sound artist, Francesca Lopez. Maybe some of you know him. He's a Spanish artist, actually, now based in Ireland. And we were working on a piece, and he sent me his recordings, and immediately I heard particle physics. Maybe I'm just kind of obsessed with this area, but there was this static noise and these very small pin-prick points, little cracks and stuff, and I began to imagine them as tiny particles exploding, very small things. So I began to draw my visual insinuations of Francesco's music, and this is kind of like the starting point then for creating the visuals. Then often I would, once I got an idea of what these things were, I'd start to create a little cartoon. And here's like a kind of little cartoon of, the start and the end of this scenography, this scenario of these particles being informed by Francesco's sound. So these fictional narratives, conjectures, and science poetry, science of imaginary solutions. So moving on to chromophore. By the time I started doing chromophore, this kind of work, I started to think much more about kind of the strategies that I wanted to use. For example, associative bindings, which would be things like the relationship between color tone and frequency. I mean, if I asked everybody here, if you're going to change a color into sound, which one's the high frequency, yellow or blue? You think it's blue? Yellow? Yellow? Who thinks yellow? I'm curious. And who thinks blue? Okay, so there clearly is a few less blues than yellows. So, I don't know whether you guys have read up on that, but I think probably instinctively you think that a brighter color must have a higher frequency. It seems to suggest that that must be the case. So this is what I meant by associative bindings, how I would interpret color, how would I interpret this color as sound. But then, we also have symbolic and metaphorical bindings. A good example actually is Norman McLaren with metaphorical bindings, because he created these, and also Stan Brakhage. They create these wonderful films. Well, actually, Stan maybe is not a good example because he didn't always use sound, but Norman McLaren is a good example because he used to scratch onto film and add layers onto film and create these glyphs and signs which were almost like a kind of form of notation. They were metaphorically representing the sounds that he was using. And then the relationship between three-dimensional forms to sound spatialization. How, for example, if things move through space, how can I move sound around? I mean, the great thing about 5.1 sound and beyond, if you've got a multi-array speaker, is you can really start to play with the movement of sound. So if things move, a good example is if things move across the screen from left to right, you can pan the sound, but that's the most typical and obvious example. You can do many more things with spatial sound. And you can also confound all the audience's expectations by doing the opposite or changing these kinds of directional flows. Textual modulations and synergies corresponding to melodic and harmonic rhythmic designs. Yeah, that's kind of very connected to this associative kind of representation and connection. And obviously, as you've already seen, I was quite interested in these psychoperceptual effects. What happens when you use very, very, very flashing and very, very stroboscopic ideas, aesthetics, how you can affect. I mean, of course, you can't really do this stuff so easily anymore because it needs to be like a health warning to make sure that no one's going to have a seizure, because these things can affect people so bad that they can actually, they can trigger fits and stuff. But they're also been used traditionally in cinema and structuralist cinema. People like Tony Conrad, his famous flicker films. So these are a great inspiration. Yeah, it goes into the realm of visceral cinema where you actually, you can actually feel your body connecting to these things. And then dynamic parameter mapping. I don't want to get too technical, but it's this idea that these mappings between sound and image, they can become so static that they can become predictable. And when they become predictable, they can be a bit boring. If you have to watch an audio-visual performance and you get a grasp of the connection, then after a while, it's like where you can predict the next scene in a movie. You kind of know the outcome. So what you can do is you can set up performative ways of changing these mappings so that they change over time, and it gives it a performative feel, and it avoids mechanical translations between domains to avoid literal and predictive translations. So these are just some ideas and things that I've been thinking about while I was doing these. I'm not actually going to show you this one because I want to make sure I get through most of my slides. This piece, Parhelia, really is a continuation, again, of using these very strict primitive shapes. I'm a big fan of simple primitive shapes, circles, squares, and then doing various things to them, segmenting them. I like the Platonic aspect to these very irreducible primitives. But they're also, clearly a circle is also very malleable and usable in terms of if you want to use this kind of form in a dome. And if you're working in planetariums, it's a little bit tricky because planetariums usually have a kind of a daily plan of fairly public outreaching shows on. It's very difficult to access them. So if you're going to work from afar, for me, one of the strategies I used was by using things that I knew potentially could work, which were, playing around with constructing and deconstructing hemispheric geometry, which you can easily do with the kinds of forms that I was using. What's nice about planetariums is when you see your work in a planetarium for the first time, you're like, wow, because it looks so different. It's like when you hear your sound composition on a really good stereo system or a good PA, and you're like, wow, it's transformed it. And seeing your work in a dome is a revelation, because you have to look around to see everything. You're so used to looking at a screen whereby everything is contained within a single point of reference. With the dome, you have to kind of bodily engage with this thing. So I like that, and then I used to hate coming back to working on screens after, because it was like, well, I used to call it postage stamp syndrome. You'd go back from doing these very big, expansive things, these spaces, whereby, the color and the light would actually, resonate into the space. You could create these, almost like these color-filled experiences whereby the whole building would be immersed in these colors. And it was very difficult to go back to standard screen after doing this kind of planetarium work. This is at the Kaluga Planetarium. It's actually based, I can't remember the name of the town now, unfortunately, but it's based in Russia. And I don't know if anyone knows. And it's actually dedicated to the history of space exploration. So it was a fairly apt venue for this kind of work. This is nearly the last slide that I'm going to show you of audio-visual work, because around about 2019, well, actually it's 2017, the pandemic came and I stopped doing this kind of work. But also I was getting a little bit tired of my own work and a bit tired of the scene, really, because it seemed to me that a lot of AV work, and this is a very personal perspective, a lot of audiovisual work in big festivals seemed to be going down one path, which was this highly intense, flicker-orientated minimalism, which I was responsible for partly, but I also decided I kind of wanted to make more meditative pieces, quieter pieces, and these don't really fit into the remit of this festival kind of work. People want to be blown away by this kind of like intensity and extreme maximalism, you know. So I made this piece, which really was a kind of reaction against all my hard geometries and reaction against all my kind of noise and all the rest of it. And it was a piece inspired by a film by a kind of counterculturist guy based in New York, a guy by the name of Ira Cohen, who made this wonderful film. He was part of the New York scene in the late 1960s. You know, he worked with Tony Conrad. He made this beautiful set of photographs and films called Into the Mylar Chamber, where he photographed famous people from the American counterculture canon in this chamber with these Mylar sheets. So all the portraits are reflected, and they're very trippy. They're very psychedelic. They're very, you know, they're very of their time, but also very beautiful. And it's hard to actually see who these people are, and he dresses them up in these costumes, you know, and they all get high, and it must have been a brilliant time. What I was intrigued by was the aesthetics. I like the aesthetics, so I imagined creating a piece whereby there was a point of light behind the screen, which then would be reflected on these like morphing layers. And this is a little piece of a text by Greg Smith, which I quite like, because sometimes it's, you know, it takes another person to really kind of like focus into explaining what you're doing. Again, this was with spatial sound, but I used binaural drones this time. Binaural drones are these frequencies that you use, where you use two very similar frequencies in stereo, and what happens is you get these beats, you get these overlays of frequencies that creates this third frequency. There's lots of interesting studies done on the way that affects perception. It can put you into a calm state, a meditative state. So I wanted to use binaural drones because it seemed to kind of fit the remit of what I was trying to do with this kind of slowed down meditative piece. What's interesting about that piece is I came full circle, because it doesn't have any mechanical or software connections between the sound and the image. Although the video is generative, I'm using these shaders that can create these liquid surfaces, and then I'm deforming them with parameters that change the turbulence, so you get these very smooth outputs, and then you get these very striated, linear, complex ones. All of that was a system in its own, and I decided to completely separate the two and improvise the sound. So the sound was done on an Octatrack sampler, performance sampler, and I just loaded in lots of samples, and I improvised it. I would just watch, you know. And so, yeah, I mean, it kind of really was kind of going full circle and separating them and kind of maybe reacting against this idea that I'd built these two things so close that they were almost suffocating each other. I don't know. It was a kind of critique of what I was doing before. Yeah, although that wasn't the last performance, in fact, this piece was. I kind of see it as my last performance, because these ones were really kind of continuing. This one was quite fun, though. I'll quickly talk about this, because I reused consumer parts and mechanical parts, open source 3D models from SketchUp. And I used these as my base material, and I deformed them with generative systems, mesh deformations, then playing around with colors. So these are the guys that I got from SketchUp. They're all open source. You can freely download this stuff. Yeah, they're Creative Commons. And And then, I mean, you can see the transformation. They're quite different, the end result. And I guess one of my mantras is repeat, reuse, refine. Once you find something that you're kind of interested in, you just keep refining it and keep working on it and finding new ways. And I think as artists, we kind of have to do that because we need to get to the point where we hit that periphery where something happens, a small shift, a small tweak, a glitch, a mistake, and then suddenly we've got a whole new language. And I think that only happens when we kind of keep battling along that same path. So the pieces that I showed you using the super formula and these primitive geometrics I've kind of continued to use since. And I think what's interesting, as you can see, is the software has improved and the processing power has improved. The things are potentially more, the aesthetics have changed. I'm not saying they're more sophisticated, the aesthetics have changed. I'm pretty sure I didn't get all of your talk, but I'm sure you probably mentioned NFTs at some point. No, you didn't? Oh, okay. I won't mention them then. Good. Okay, so this one again is like cyclotron. What's interesting about this is I used Alfred Jarry's, a pataphysicist, a writer, a turn of the century writer that I've loved for many years, and I like. There's a number of novels. Dr. Faustro is one. It's a very strange form of literature, which he called pataphysics, which is the science of imaginary solutions, and really it's kind of using science in a very imaginative way to make these crazy conjectures. And he wrote this piece in 1899. I mean, to think that it's that old. And this is a description of how to create a time machine. And I used that as a specification model for creating this piece. And I made lots of loops as virtual sculptures. I'll quickly show you some of these because I still quite like them, although they won't have any sound. And in a way, this kind of harks back to the idea of the listening eye. After you're working on this stuff for so long, if I look at these and I do hear stuff, I mean, I can hear the mechanics of these. And this is what I mean by the listening eye in a way. Again, it's using the same techniques. These highly textured, nested, geometric forms with transformations. You can see my love for blending modes, how you can create these volumetric forms. And again, you know, I've kind of hooked on this monochrome thing because I love the sort of anachronistic feel to it. Almost like there's a sense that it could have been made last year, but it could have been made a bit longer as well. It kind of connects back to the idea of how can we make technologically based work future-proof when technology is continually evolving. Is there a way of doing it? And so these are like little 30-second modules. They're all repeating. They're all perfect loops. So, you know, I wanted to put enough visual information in there to kind of want you to continually have to interrogate the loops to find all the details. Yeah, and the other thing I liked about some of these is that there was lots of problems with Z sorting and layering. I mean, I won't get too technical, but with geometries, with textures, you get these weird artifacts. This is like a moire effect. This wasn't intentional, but it was like a lovely serendipitous effect from what happens when two surface layers are fighting for position within the rendering stack. I'm going to zoom through these. These ones are kind of, again, the same, but I wanted to, again, have an analog aspect to it. So I wanted to kind of create this woodblock print style in reverse form. Again, using the same strategies, just brought up to date. It shows you the software I use, which is 4V. This is a patch-based software programming, which is completely different to textual programming. This allows you to connect nodes, and these nodes could be seen as functions. They do things. And the nodes are connected with these connectors, which send that data to the node, and then the node can import the data, and it can output the data. They're like functions. They're like, it's basically essential functions, but they can also be small programs. You can get under the bonnet and you can program some of the shaders. This is actually only probably a little small part of the actual patch. I've become very interested in the patch schematics, how a patch could be isomorphic to the function of what it's trying to do. I wrote an essay actually about patch schematics maybe 15 years ago. And what also is very interesting is how differently you work when you're working in this software. Because when you're working in, I found when I'm working in textual programming, I work very locally, which is I'm very fixated on the area that I'm working in. I'm aware of the global structure, but I tend to be very, 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 very fixated on the local. But when I'm working on a patch-based programming environment, like 4V, I tend to be very global in my outlook. I need to almost hold what's going on, all of it, in a bigger understanding of what's going on. So what's great is you can, if you've got a big enough monitor, you can have all of this stuff all open and you can see it all, how it all flows, because they all connect to each other. So, pandemic. I think we all found ourselves in weird situations. Some of us were lucky enough to be with other people at the time, but many of us, myself included, I was living on my own in a flat, just moved out of London. And actually, I had a brilliant time. I mean, I really enjoyed it. I was lucky enough to be able to actually spend time at my allotment and grow vegetables and stuff like that. And that's a completely different topic. But what happened is I discovered I had this silver reed typewriter that I bought 5 or 10 years before, and I never got around to using it. I was going to use it just as a usual typewriter. I love these things. They look great. And I tried to do some typing with it, and not only was the ink completely dry, all the keys were completely clogged. I mean, there was no typing to be done from this machine, this guy here. And kind of through frustration and experimentation and kind of like a moment of, I don't know, a moment of luck, I decided that I would play around with the idea of using it as a rudimentary plotter. And if I show you another picture, you can see what I mean. So what I started to do is, if you can see my pen there, it's in the eyelet above where the hammer strikes. I still don't know what this thing is for. I don't know if anyone can tell me what that little eyelet is for on the typewriter. Because even from research, I've not easily been able to find out. But I realized I could put my pen in there and I could guide the paper backwards, forwards, up and down in a Cartesian way. And it basically intimated or it replicated a rudimentary plotter. And this appealed to me because it was at a time when everybody was going out and buying these really expensive Axie drawers. And I just thought it really funny that, it was kind of amusing that I was doing these hand plots. They were very slow. But something really interesting happened because I realized that I could transform ideas that I was thinking about in programming into this system. So it's about the idea of finding a limit of technology or finding a limit with a piece of machinery and then using it in a way that wasn't intended. And, there's canonical examples of when this has happened. A great example in music is the Roland 303. Yeah, it was designed for a certain kind of bass sound in the 1980s, and then a little bit later on, these guys in Detroit used it in a completely wrong way by changing the resonance and the frequencies, and they invented a whole genre of music, acid house. And I think this has always been an interesting thing for me, how you can suddenly repurpose, reuse things in completely the way that they weren't intended. And so, I started making these plotter drawings, and I've made hundreds of them now. I mean, I've made maybe 1,000 of them. And so they're procedural. They're very procedural. They're very rule set based. And they're basically exploring repetition, iteration, and investigating the expression of difference within the bounds of repetition and the measure of freedom within the limits of constraint. The whole idea is I become the algorithm. Yeah? I think like an algorithm. And what's interesting then is these things that take nanoseconds to execute and are completely invisible in their own enterprise, I become privy to, I can experience. So I can imagine what it would be like if a computer had to repeat these same things again and again. And then I started to use really simple algorithms like simple cellular automator and number series and various things that I was doing with software and then kind of recoding them back into the physical world. And hopefully, you know, they're still abstract enough. What was fun is I started giving them titles which were the software. So in this case, the title, which is N4 brackets, arrow down 6, arrow up, blah, 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 that's the title of the piece. But it's also a description, a recipe, or a program for creating that piece. You can see the arrow, it says arrow 6 down, so I go 6 down on now, and then I go all the way up the same line, and then I go 5 down and 1 across. But I started to write down a notation because I found that I would find patterns that I would like, but I would need to find a way of remembering what I did. So, and it was also fun to give these pieces the title. So the notation is the title, and it's the software for creating the piece. Actually, this series of drawings found its way into a publication by PSW the Gallery, and the name of the book was called "You Might Not Know an Algorithm Until You've Typed It," which is again this idea that really to understand what's going on with these processes, you kind of have to become them. You know, you have to become algorithmic. But it's also a little play on Goethe's statement, which was, he said, you really don't know a plant until you've drawn it. That's what he said. So it's kind of an ape on this concept of observation is really the only way of getting to grips on a fundamental level of understanding. These guys were printed in 45 copies. It was 2 editions, and they sold out in a day. Actually, Zach Lieberman posted this book on his Twitter, and it sold out in that day because Zach Lieberman's got like 100,000 followers or something like that on Twitter. This book is actually printed on an old mimeograph, which is a very strange old printing machine that was invented in Germany. It's like a stencil printing system. And Petra, who runs this gallery, she uses this motto, artistic publishing with art daily printing techniques. And she's released maybe 25 of these artist books now. You can go to the website and you can find them. And she's done a whole range of different styles. I'm exploring different things in all of these. This one's called Human Error, and really I was investigating what happens when you really try to be an algorithm. Humans actually are not very good at that kind of stuff. You know, they're okay for a while, but if you're forced to turn a person into an algorithm for like more than an hour, I can assure you it starts to get tricky. It starts to get hairy. And so there is actually a mistake in this one, although it's a little bit hard to see. But if you knew the rule set for what I was trying to do in all of these, there is actually one mistake. So again, exploring the fragility of human computation compared to that of machines. So yeah, a whole range of things, and I played around with standard typewriter. I called it automatic pattern writing. I was interested in this idea that in the Second World War, there was this whole story about espionage and how housewives were encoding secret messages in knitwear. Because if you think about it, knitting or crocheting is a on-off, purl, one, no purl. So you can encode sequences into these things. So there's lots of kind of interesting different stories, and then these very, very structural systems, and then coming back to textiles again, and I realized I've got not much time. Also playing around with mantras, and mantras have this very connective idea of iteration as well. Mantras are kind of like loops, do-while loops, keep repeating until you can get out of the loop. So this one is actually called Manifesto. You can't read it, but it's kind of a manifesto for this kind of work, and it's about repetition and about the state of mind that you go into when you're creating this kind of work. This one's called Broken Mantra. I hope you can see probably why. Mantras are text repetitions which are themselves like computer loops of iterations of lines of code. This one was also published by another publishing house in Portugal. So I'd like to show you the drawing actually, and then hopefully I've just got one more thing to show you after that. Okay, so what I just wanted to say while you're watching this is it kind of doesn't end here, because then these pieces then found their way back into some new generative work. So my most recent generative work was about recoding some of the things I was doing on the typewriter back into algorithms. So you can see most of my process has always been about this kind of shifting from one side to the other, and then how I can move back into that. So I started working on the typewriter, and I started working with text again, and it connected with my work as a textile artist. And then I became interested in this idea that the historical link between computers and textiles and punch paper cards, and I made a series of generative artworks that explore the use of text as a material. And I was interested in this metaphorical link, which is, we talk about weaving a yarn or something like that, but we also have this, there are also etymological links between the word text and textile. And go and say that these typewriter drawings then informed, I was commissioned to do some static generative work. And I begin to think about the way, I'm not sure how clear you can see the text on there, but these are all made, these are letters and glyphs from a scanned font set of the letter typewriter. So the typewriter I was using to do the other pieces, I used the scanned font set so that I could have this very analog feel. And these explore the link between textiles and text in different ways. I could talk about textual programming, but this is my palette of glyphs, so I have to have a palette of glyphs. This is kind of my material. And what I like about these Unicode symbols is they are very textile-like. This is a whole range of pieces that I've done since, playing around with the use of symbols and glyphs in different ways. These are all generative and they're all static. And this is like literally the stuff I'm working on now, which is I'm only using these famed block elements which were introduced by the Unicode Consortium for terminal emulation software. Starts to get technical, but these symbols come from a time when there were no keyboards or screens attached to computers, and the first terminals that came along used these kinds of graphical symbols. So this is playing around with, it plays, these new pieces are kind of playing around with nostalgia for that era, the 1980s, the 1970s, the 1960s, with these printouts. Actually, you can see a little bit closer to how these things are made up. This one is really, 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 really pretentious, actually. Because this is actually an encipherment of a Unicode Consortium meeting when they decided which of the characters they would use. And this is an encoding of the part of the fragment of the minutes of the Consortium's meeting where they talk about their day trip to a volcanic island in Greece. I just thought it was really amusing to kind of encode this ridiculous information from the meeting when these symbols were supposed to be used. Again, you can see a little bit closer there. So this is what I'm working on at the moment, actually, this piece. And although I've got a few more slides,